Oh, thank you. Sorry, I have a cold, so if it's hard to understand me, I apologize for that. So basically, of course, post-Arab Spring, we have a focus increasingly on the rise of Islamist opposition, which has led governments across the region to focus on the Muslim Brotherhood. And then I argue, actually, a focus on the Brotherhood increasingly inside of the Gulf, which we've seen with the ongoing crisis, lies beyond regional politics alone. Rather, the persistent presence of Brotherhood movements inside GCC states has led their governments to articulate different policies towards such groups. Indeed, each of the Gulf states seems to have developed a distinct strategy in terms of how to manage the Ikhwan, ranging from a soft form of co-optation in Qatar to a harsher crackdown in the UAE. The Muslim Brotherhood, thus, I would argue, is seen as more politically threatening in kind of closed systems like Saudi Arabia and the UAE than in states like Kuwait and Bahrain, where the Brotherhood can openly participate in parliamentary elections. As a whole, I'd also argue that government treatment in the Gulf of Brotherhood organizations varies according to the degree to which regimes there consider Brotherhood groups linked to broader movements for political reform. So the more they seem to collaborate together to urge for reform, the more dangerous they're seen. And this is more so in kind of the more closed systems of the Gulf. And so now I'm going to give just a brief snapshot of each of the GCC states as quickly as I can, and then I think this will make clear kind of what's happening in terms of changing regional order inside of the GCC and why we have this kind of anti-Qatar quartet of of Bahrain, Egypt, UAE, and Saudi. So I'll start with looking at Bahrain. So of course, Bahrain is distinct because most oppositional Islamist groups there are Shia. And so the Brotherhood has, of course, traditionally been allied with the ruling Al Khalifa family. That's not to say, of course, that the Bahraini Ikhwan is inactive. It has a political bloc as well as a social bloc. And in parliament, Al-Minbar, which is a political bloc, tends to support the government's position. It's interesting that the Bahraini foreign minister has openly stated that the Brotherhood is a terrorist organization, yet it hasn't formally been banned. Over and over, the Bahraini government has said that the Brotherhood there has a special status. And so it seems that the Bahraini government is kind of going along with this anti-Brotherhood rhetoric in the rest of the Gulf, but there does remain some Brotherhood activity at home. So then looking at Kuwait, you have a very different model. The Kuwaiti Brotherhood, I'd argue, especially since 2006, has become increasingly focused on broader political reform movements. So focusing on anti-corruption, focusing on getting an elected prime minister, things like this that are not seen, so very much pro-democracy rather than kind of a very narrow social reform agenda, which maybe they had adopted earlier on in the movement's history. Because the Kuwaiti Brotherhood has been in parliament for so long, I'd say the government there is not really concerned about its potential to disrupt things. And so the Kuwaiti Brotherhood has managed to maintain its presence inside of parliament, and where we have seen kind of limited crackdown, it's not been focused on Islamists, but rather on kind of where the broader opposition movement is seen to have gone too far. So, for instance, changes in the electoral law in 2012, which were considered to disadvantage oppositional groups, led to an opposition-wide boycott for 4 years, which included the Muslim Brotherhood. And so in Kuwait, you see this, the government's policies are again informed by their experiences with the Muslim Brotherhood. When we move to Oman, the Brotherhood, of course, is less relevant there since Ibadi Islam is kind of more dominant there. The Brotherhood did have an affiliate inside of Oman, but there was a crackdown in 1994, which led to the arrests of hundreds of people on charges of subversion. Some of those accused of subversion and of being Brotherhood members included a former ambassador to the US, a former Air Force commander, and 2 ministerial undersecretaries, suggesting that perhaps there was some kind of Islamist influence on government, but at present there's really no kind of organized Muslim Brotherhood group. And I think that's why we see Oman, by and large, sitting on the sidelines as the Gulf crisis unfolds, because there's not really a Brotherhood movement there. It's not very politically relevant, and so Oman doesn't seem to have a dog in the fight, so to speak, when it comes to this Gulf crisis. The Qatari example is also quite interesting because, of course, Qatar doesn't have an active Muslim Brotherhood branch. It was founded in 1975 formally, but even at its height was pretty informal. It didn't have a political branch. It only briefly had a publication, didn't really have a formal meeting group, so it was quite an informal organization. It decided to dissolve itself in 1999. And of course, during the period it was active, it was not very oppositional towards the government. It decided to dissolve ultimately not due to government pressure or anything, but because members decided that after having done an internal study, that there wasn't so much that the Brotherhood could provide for Qatari citizens. And this begs the question of kind of what is the role of the Brotherhood in these very wealthy rentier states. So you have states wherein you don't need Islamist groups to provide social services. They're also not needed to compete in elections, for instance, in Qatar. And so there's kind of a difference in strategy in terms of how the Brotherhood would work in somewhere like Qatar. And so ultimately it has disbanded, and so any kind of remaining influence would be, I'd say, largely informal. But again, because the Qatari government never really had issues with the political issues or felt politically threatened by the Brotherhood, I'd say this has influenced its actions abroad towards not only the Brotherhood but other Islamist groups. They're just not seen as very threatening. When we turn to Saudi Arabia, I'd say that this is where we see most clearly that crackdowns on the Brotherhood coincide with when the Brotherhood is considered to be aligned with broader political reform movements. So of course in the mid-1990s, the Sahwa movement, which was not exclusively Brotherhood but it contained some Brotherhood members, was cracked down upon, and this was seen largely as a political threat, politically threatening, and included the Brotherhood, and so the Brotherhood was seen from that time forward, I'd say, with some periods of détente as fundamentally politically threatening. In fact, in 2002, the Minister of Interior went so far as to accuse the Muslim Brotherhood of being, in his words, the source of all evils in the kingdom, which is, of course, pretty extreme. I'd say that this, of course, and of course, Dr. Jamal can talk more about this topic, but I'd say that really, since Mohammed bin Salman has risen to the ranks of Crown Prince, we see more and more anti-Brotherhood rhetoric, of course, the jailing of 22 figures in September, just more and more crackdown, and of course this goes to the trend that we're seeing region-wide, I'd say, towards repression, and I think it is targeted to at least to a certain extent in Saudi Arabia against Islamists. So finally, when we come to the Emirati example, I'd say this is the clearest example of a government which feels very much threatened by the Brotherhood at home and therefore threatened by them abroad. So the Brotherhood was established there in 1974 and effectively was shut down in 2012 with the arrest of about 100 members of Islah, which was a Brotherhood affiliate inside of the UAE. During the period that Islah was active, it wasn't terribly politically organized. Of course, it's difficult inside of the UAE because of the lack of parliamentary elections. But because some members of Islah were involved in a 2011 petition which called for greater participation in government, then the Islamists were lumped in with dangerous political reformers. And so this led to arrests of 94 members of Islah. They were seen as threatening because of their links to the political reform movement, again, as we saw in Saudi Arabia. And so I think, of course, we see the Emirati and the Saudi stances kind of taking the lead in terms of what we're seeing in the Gulf crisis, especially in terms of isolating Qatar on grounds that it has supported Islamist movements unduly. But I think also, and I'll close here, I think the fact that Brotherhood movements managed to survive even in some of the world's wealthiest states and states in which they can't participate in parliamentary elections demonstrates the flexibility of the organization, as well as the appeal of its ideology and its ability to adapt its shape and its activities to suit different political environments. And I think because of that flexibility, the Brotherhood in the Gulf, despite the ongoing crisis, is likely to remain socially and politically relevant in the region.